The boroughs are New York City. The burbs are everywhere else. Real estate is the ultimate game of risk and reward. It's the biggest investment most people ever make. Fortunes are made over a lifetime and lost in a day. And we're not playing with monopoly money. How do you stay ahead? Who's buying? Who's selling? And why? What do they know? We want the truth. You need an edge. Boroughs Burbs is your secret weapon, giving you the insider knowledge and strategies you need to succeed in the high-stakes world of real estate. From Palm Beach to Palm Springs, Manhattan to Malibu, we press the experts to expose the pain, find the deals, and occasionally predict the future. That's Boroughs Burbs, Thursdays, 3 o'clock Eastern, noon Pacific, because everyone can make money in real estate.
Welcome, everybody. Boroughs Burbs, episode 155, season 4, Renovate or Rebuild. Today, I'm your host, John Engel, and I'm going to see if I can find, there we go. I want to thank our sponsor, Grace Farms, 80 Acres, New Canaan, really great community resource doing really important work, and they've got their big benefit coming up. Let's see, events, Philharmonic. So go get your tickets. The 9th anniversary benefit featuring the London Philharmonic, October 21st. We are Boroughs Burbs, hosted by two handsome gentlemen, John Engel, Roberto. This is Roberto here. That's his September newsletter. You can find it on the Manhattan real estate market, and you'll find that at robertocabrera.com. You'll find me at theengelteam.com talking about the Fairfield County, Connecticut market. And today on the show, Burr Salvatore, architects. We've got Mary Burr, we've got Ryan Salvatore, and we're going to talk about renovate or rebuild. Welcome. Oh, Roberto, say something. Say hi.
Hello, everybody. I'm here on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Very happy to have you guys back.
I knew I forgot something. Thank you, Roberto. All right. We just wanted to get into it so quickly, right?
Indeed.
All right. So I think this comes up quite a bit. I had a client 6 months ago who said, I've got an estimate to take my little house, add on to it. The estimates, which were 2 million, have now grown to 3 million or more, and I'm starting to have second thoughts. And I'm like, well, what? What's going on here? And he said, well, I love this location, and we're invested in this location right off of South Avenue. Walk into town, walk to the restaurants, walk to the schools. And so I think a little bit of the fear of the unknown, just cutting loose, selling it, and starting over is, for a lot of people, too much uncertainty and too much work and economic uncertainty as well. In the end, they cut the cord. They sold the little house and bought and are renovating a larger house rather than adding on. So I wanted to talk to you, and I wanted to talk to Roberto about the decision-making process, what goes into the decision-making process on rebuilding, starting over versus renovating what you've got. So what are your, start us off here, Ryan, Mary. Talk to us about how you see the topic.
We talk a lot about this, and I think it comes down to the individual client's aspirations, and those aspirations could be scope, right? If you want to replace your dated cherry cabinets, that doesn't mean tear down your house. Are you touching every room? Then it might make more sense. And it also is a stylistic preference. We find that certain vintages of houses, I'm speaking mostly about residential right now, but certain vintages of houses, like 1920s houses, for example, tend to be a fabulous time. And we most often would say renovate in that case. Whereas there are other vintages, some mid-century modern houses can be totally fabulous, especially in New Canaan. But there are also a lot of ranch houses done in the middle of the 20th century, which might be less desirable. They might have lower ceilings. They might not be commensurate with their site. So in that case, it might be a tear down.
I've got one of those right now. I've got one, a 1947 ranch on a double lot with water views. And I think to myself, oh, that's definitely a rebuild candidate. Somebody can build where there's a 2,000-foot ranch, could build a 10,000-foot house and probably will. And yet people are drawn to the sweet, diminutive proportions. They're drawn to a ranch, single level living. And I can see a lot of the people that I bring to this house, I can see them being drawn to it emotionally. And yet, when push comes to shove, I think they're going to find that it's too expensive to renovate a 1947 ranch, that there's just not enough there worth saving. That they can probably hire you to make them a brand new version of that for less.
Well, the reality is they might in the end spend more, but they get more per value dollar spent. Or excuse me, more value per dollar spent. So for example, in that case, right, this 1940s vintage house probably has a really unpleasant basement. And no matter what, at the end of the day, if it's a one-story house, converting it to a two-story house is a major initiative. The plan just doesn't work. You're stuck with ceiling heights because everybody thinks, oh, we'll just take the roof off and put, a second floor on. And conceptually, yeah, that works. But the reality is, in today's market, if we're designing a new house, we default really to 10-foot first floor ceilings. That's a lot harder to do with an existing wall. You end up taking it down to the first floor deck, and once you've taken it down to the first floor deck,
What are you saving?
you're like, what am I saving this foundation that's 80 years old for, and is never going to be an inviting place for me to go, even if I just want a place to put my holiday decorations or something. So,
but even houses that are 25 years old, I mean, I find like the systems within the houses, because of the technology, is so much better. And just from a standpoint of even the space that air conditioners take and things like that, I mean, everything is so much better now. Even a house that's 25 years old, if you buy it and you're thinking, I'm going to use this house for another 25, 30, 40 years because this is just where I'm going to live. I mean, so you have to, to redo all the systems in a house, to literally rip all of it out and put new stuff in there. I mean, is it worth doing that, or do you just raise the house?
I think it depends what the house looks like.
Yeah.
If there is an enduring quality to the house, and that's, Mary was saying, that's a much easier, or maybe put differently, it's much more likely that's the case if we're talking about something that's 20s, 30s, 40s vintage. Something that's 80s vintage, 90s vintage, it's a tough pill to swallow because there's so much use life left in the house just from a utility standpoint. But from an aesthetic or from a design standpoint, likely it's not that appealing, or certainly it's not irreplaceable, such that should the constraints of that house be the constraints that drive the way you want to live or what your ambitions are from the design side? And the answer is probably no. But it's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, because I have a client who's owned this house, and he said that he was going to renovate the house. He really thought through it, and the pricing was probably going to be $800,000, $900,000 to renovate the house. And then he's thinking about raising the house, but that's a $2 million sink.
Yeah,
and that's a big delta.
Yeah, and so then it comes down to in the kind of coarsest sense, utility. Like there's a certain utility that you get from living in a certain place, and you can assign a value to that. And there's a certain disutility you get from living with the compromises of some other place. And you just basically are weighing, does this make sense or not for me to renovate or tear down? I mean, I feel like the best renovations that we've done are renovations where there's really one of two outcomes and very little in between, I think. When they're comprehensive renovations, either there is an amazing existing house And that becomes a springboard. The richness of that architecture becomes a springboard for what the improvements are. Or alternatively, there's basically a house that really has no significant architectural value. There might be an emotional value. There might be a real estate value that precludes us from building a new house, or a zoning, which is a really important consideration, a zoning regulation that precludes us from doing that. But where we have a lot freer reign and can really get to what the client wants without a lot of the compromises. But the in-between, well, I feel like I need to save these 7 walls because we just renovated this room, or the past owners just renovated this room 3 years ago. We don't want to touch that room. And that becomes the tail that wags the dog on a renovation all around it. That's really problematic. And there, the best solution is, well, maybe this is.
Oops.
Oops. You're freezing up.
Yeah, you froze. As he was saying.
Yeah. Well, so I don't know if you can. Yeah, I think we're losing Ryan and Mary. Can you hear us? All right, come back when you can. I'm going to hit share screen and show you some of the projects, and they'll join us, I guess, back when they can. But here's some of the projects that we were talking about with them. Last time we were with the Burr Salvatore on the show, they talked about this project, Silver Beach, down on the water. And as Ryan was just saying, sometimes you're limited, especially on the water, by regulations, coastal flooding regulations, building regulations on the water, very tight. The second reason, I guess, that you might be hemmed in by regulations are if, like on this property, you have multiple buildings, and really the zoning hasn't really caught up to say, yeah, you can have multiple houses on your property. So you tend not to take down any of these accessory buildings. It tends to force your hand at looking at renovating accessory buildings on the property. They talked about this one being rebuilt, new on the right, and this being a renovation on the left. Are you back with
We're
us?
with you. Sorry, all of a sudden Ryan was talking and Roberta's face was frozen, and we realized that the internet had popped out. So we're back.
So maybe you can talk about this picture with the 2 blue structures. The one on the left, renovated. The one on the right, new. Why?
The one on the left is a barn that dates from the 1860s. So there was some emotional value to that, just the idea of that, a building with that long a history. But probably one of the key drivers on the same par with that is that building was closer to the property line than it otherwise could have been.
Mm-hmm.
So it really made sense on a site. While this is a relatively expansive waterfront site, every foot counts on a waterfront site. So to the extent that that could be pushed to the side and really serve as a bracket for the property, was a big incentive to maintain it and not tear it down. It also just, and this gets a little bit, John, what you were saying, the idea of the accessory building or the auxiliary building. Here is a barn. I mean, what a great amenity to have as a kind of secondary, but it's now been transformed into a guest house. But there's a great narrative there that, again, I think goes to the emotional value of it.
Is it in some cases where if you touch that or if you attempt to redo it, they say because it's no longer conforming to a code that you can't, if you take it down, you can't put it back?
So
I was going to say zoning regulations, certainly, yes. It's not so much code compliance as zoning. If your structure is grandfathered in, then you can get a variance. But for example, we just rebuilt a structure in Japan on the waterfront that is in a front yard setback. And the rule for rebuilding it is that the volume has to remain exactly the same. And we were able to get a variance to put dormers on it, which changes the volume. But further than that, you probably won't get it.
And there's other really good examples in flood zones, for example, where most of the area, let's just talk about Fairfield County for a second. Most of the municipalities have rules where you can only improve for houses that are located within the flood zone, not properties, but where the structures are actually located below the base flood elevation, which is a FEMA standard, it's a national standard. mapped across really all of the coast. The municipalities limit how much you can improve, and often it's up to 50% of the value of the structure. And that's a really important distinction, because on a waterfront site, the real value is in the land, particularly on the older ones. The structures don't have a significant amount of value. So let's just make numbers up. Let's say that you have a property that sells for $5 million. That might have a structure on it that's worth, call it $1.5 million, versus the land is valued at $3.5 million. And then you look at it and you say, okay, well, I can only put 50% of $1.5 million in here. This sounds crazy to say, but $750,000 doesn't go very far in this construction market, particularly if you're talking about a comprehensive renovation. So you're in a situation where, okay, what I want, I can't get out of this, but yet I don't want to tear this whole house down, but sometimes you're forced to do that. And of course, once you do that, then you have to build the house to the flood, conforming to the flood regulations, et cetera. We worked on a house like this a few years ago where the clients bought a house that had been really significantly improved. It just wasn't improved to their taste. It didn't work. It was a house from the early 80s. It just wasn't the right fit for all the right reasons, candidly. And it just made much more sense to tear that down than to try and, well, we couldn't renovate it. If they could have waited 5 years, but even then their hands would have been tied to how much they could do.
And we find this really frustrating sometimes. I realize the regulations are there for life safety reasons. I mean, the intent is right, but we've seen beautiful historic houses on the water torn down for this same reason. The value of the structure just isn't enough to make renovating it viable.
Yeah.
At what point is it considered rebuilding versus renovating? I know that where I'm sitting on Elm Street in New Canaan, the building to my right was sitting on the property line, and it was a car wash, right? No design value. And they said, well, we'll consider that a renovation if you leave the one wall standing and build the rest of the walls, can be new, and the rest of the structure. And I know that that's also true on my left. There's some buildings here. There's a gray, it looks like a house, and I think they took it down to one wall with an electric meter hanging on it, and rebuilt the rest of the house. So at what point is the definition a rebuild, and is it a legal definition or is it a practical definition?
I see Scott Hobbs grinning ear to ear here, and maybe I'll see if he wants to
dive in, Scott.
I'll let you guys take the first crack at it. I mean, it used to be every community differently, and you could do a lot of things. Not surprisingly, that changed. Go ahead.
No, I go keep going, because
I would a lot of it is by municipality. So it's just, I mean, in some areas you used to be able just to again leave one wall. Even in some of those areas, a lot of the building inspectors actually go ahead and they understand that what's happening is kind of dumb, but you have to go pro forma. So some people hypothetically may have actually put new studs next to old studs through an inspection, and then those old studs may have disappeared. So it's whatever you have to do to make that actually work.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a hard and fast rule. I think that's exactly right. It's in our experience, it varies so much from municipality to municipality. I mean, on the commercial side, the building code has some very clear criteria for different types of renovations and how they're classified, et cetera. It's a little looser on the residential side.
Scott, you're familiar with Southampton. In Southampton Village, there's been at least 3 houses that I've seen where, and I don't know if they're some sort of preservation or whatever, these houses should be raised, and the amount of money they're putting in is literally like rebuilding the house. However, they literally carved everything out of the house, and the carcass of the house is just floating, and it's on stilts. They completely do the foundation. We do the foundation, everything, and then they renovate the house. Do they have to do that? Is that a personal choice from the owner?
A lot of that decision about rebuild
based upon that exact property.
Well, a lot of the decision between rebuild and renovate comes down to zoning. And so if a house was built 60 years ago with side yards or front yard setbacks or height restrictions or other things that were okay at the time, And since then, the zoning has changed and become more and more and more restrictive. If you tear the house down, you're starting from scratch. You can never rebuild anything like what's there. If, however, if you save the house and you elevate it and you put in the piles, you do the other stuff, then you get to keep at least the existing non-conformance.
And the other, not just on setbacks, but FAR or floor area is where that can be really meaningful, because the floor area regulations weren't enacted when a lot of these houses were built. So places like Southampton Village, where you have tight sites and maybe some bigger, older houses on it, it's worth it because you might lose 500 to 1,000 square feet, which could be 25% of that building's floor area. And that has a meaningful impact on how that building operates, et cetera, you know, how the plan works, all of that stuff.
And, you know, so a lot of foundations are very damp, but now with technology and everything, they're much drier. I had a friend who had a very small house, and under the house, they really excavated and they created so much space subterranean in the house and had like skylights so that it would bring light into. Is that viable, or did they kind of get around the rules?
Where there's a will, there's a way.
But are you seeing people do that to create square footage in the house?
Yeah, we just finished a renovation about 2 years ago where we lowered the entire basement slab by, I don't know, 18 inches, and then in one area lowered it like 4.5 feet into the water table for a simulator, all while there's a house above it. So totally, and that again could be driven by FAR. In this case it wasn't, but I'm just saying that could be free FAR that you get by doing that. So there's real value there, even if it's a really expensive way to go about adding square footage.
This is maybe a little bit off topic, but I got to clarify on this FAR question. When you talk about FAR, it's a measurement of volume. Floor area ratio is a volume, and towns like, let's get real specific, Greenwich measures buildability in FAR. New Canaan, in contrast, a similar town, measures coverage and height.
It's both.
We tell you, you have this much coverage in our zoning rules, and you have a limit of 40 feet, and you have to have some setbacks. So that's how we get to the same thing. It seems to me, and tell me, Scott, tell me, Ryan, Mary, that the towns like Southampton, like the ones in Japan, like the ones in Greenwich, which are held to a FAR standard, is a tighter standard. And when you're held to a FAR standard and a tight standard in these communities, it does it more likely that you're going to, within the requirements of FAR, have to legally rebuild rather than start over. Would you say that that's a trend in these very exclusive communities, we've mentioned Greenwich and Southampton, to move their regulations into a tighter FAR standard instead of a coverage standard?
That's a good question. I can't really comment on whether it's a trend or not, but I do, as I recall, we worked on a project in Southampton Village a couple of years ago, and as I recall, they had just tightened their regulation. And so, you know, that's anecdotal, of course. I actually think that the FAR regulations are harder to manage than just a blanket coverage or you know, lots of other zoning regulations. They just add an additional layer, and it's really complex. It's not just as simple as, okay, you can build 4,000 square feet of floor area on the site. It's, well, but if your basement is half out of the ground, you get to count it at this much. And if your basement's this much out of the ground, it's this much, but you get an exemption for a mechanical room. And there are ways to exploit those regulations too. And I'm saying exploit in the best possible way, but like it's a little bit of a game.
But there were other limiting factors too. Like Greenwich oftentimes is looking at the volume of what you're building. We're doing a new pool house right now in Greenwich, and if the main house is over 10,000 square feet, all of a sudden they're paying attention to the volume. You can't have more than a certain volume on the site, in addition to the FAR regulations. And actually, we've come up against coverage issues in New Canaan on projects as well. And that can be just as onerous. This is a kind of an interesting case study. There was a property we worked on, a new house in New Canaan, that was the site was bifurcated by the town line between Stamford and New Canaan. The address was in New Canaan, but the property was half in Stamford, half in New Canaan. Well, they only count the square footage of the New Canaan portion towards your building coverage. So your site is artificially small, which means your house has to be artificially much smaller than all your neighbors' houses who have the same size properties, but may not be bifurcated by two municipalities. And we had to get a variance, but it took us a few tries, and we had to make it much smaller than the client wanted to make it because of this coverage issue.
But there again, there's an argument for if the existing house, which predated the regulations, had extra square footage. Well, do we really want to give that up? You know, it's like, do we want the space, or do we want things configured the way we want them, or do we want this to look the way we want on the outside?
In the end, they tore down one ranch house to build a new ranch house because these were empty nesters in their 80s. But they wanted new construction.
Should we
in your 80s doing a renovation,
right?
Wow.
Brave. Well, no, not even a renovation, a new house.
wow.
You want to take us through some of your case studies and we can illustrate some of these.
The top left could be interesting from a zoning standpoint.
Okay. American in gray.
Sorry, no, actually, well, both are interesting. I should have said top right. That one is what I.
House on the center.
Well, it was
built by Hobbs.
great collaboration.
Who?
Sorry.
Who?
Oh yeah. So this is a waterfront site where again the flood regulations were at play. Couldn't save the existing house, nor did it make sense to. And I think that the clients, though, were really attuned to the character of old houses. So it was really important, like, let's make this feel like there's some patina here. And so we got vintage fireplace mantles. We really used their house, which dated from I think the teens or so, their house that they lived in before this, as the primary driver in how this would be organized, at least the center portion of the house. So I think that's one way that you can correct for loss of the detailing and the character that is embedded in so many of the older houses.
It's tough to raise a house high enough to meet the flood regulations and not make it look like it is sticking out like a sore thumb from the landscape. But we took great pains to stagger the grade and have it rise very gradually. You'll see it in the front and the back, so that it doesn't have that effect that you see increasingly.
So let's talk about a few things. Did you reconfigure, like, for example, the entrance so you can see all the way through and there's doors in the back?
No, this is new construction.
House, but
no,
it was a new house as a result of the basically impossibility of achieving what they wanted out of a renovation. The other, if you go back, the top left one is a renovation, is a comprehensive renovation, where and you know, this was a case where it didn't cost as much to renovate it as it would have to replace it, but they spent a real significant amount of money here, really respecting the house and restoring it, and we did some significant additions. But this house was really stripped down to the studs, and you know, Roberto, exactly what you're talking about. All of the systems replaced in this house. This is a new house for all intents and purposes, but the volume of the house changed. I don't know that we have a before picture up, but
yeah. But something that's interesting about this house is the ceilings are never going to be 10 feet at the first floor, and that wasn't important to them. It is for some people.
There was an emotion.
But for this project, just curiously, were they grappling with the choice of, do we raise the house or renovate it, or they were definitely going to renovate it?
So it started off as a renovation and incrementally expanded. The scope incrementally expanded, but we had several discussions along the way, like, have we crossed the threshold where it would be better to tear it down? And ultimately that was the decision that they made. But I think there was an emotional attachment here too. They had their three kids, as I recall, were born in the house. They had lived there certainly for the 8 or 9 years before. They were really attached to the house as it was, even if it wasn't right exactly. And they wanted everything sort of brought up to contemporary standards.
Just because we're talking about the decision-making process, can we talk about where was that threshold where they were going to be, you know, they were going to spend $2 million, and then the alternative was 3 million. Like, where was that?
So
Like, give me an
I
idea.
don't even know that it was a budget issue, candidly. I mean, one could always make that case from a budget standpoint, but I think the last thing that we tackled as we were going through schematic design was it came about like, okay, you know what, we're doing all this other work, we're adding a wing on the house here, we really should do our kitchen also. And at that point, we were touching every part of that house. And so the question was really, okay, we're doing all this work. If we were to start from scratch, what would you get that you're not getting right now? And we had it was a brief discussion about it because they were really committed to saving it. And I think, but it was about like, okay, is this where you would put the house on the site? Is this where are these the adjacencies you would create? Even though we were reconfiguring so much of the house, like, could it still be optimized more? Things, Mary mentioned the ceiling height as a key decision or conversation there. And they were sort of the mindset, we don't want to walk into a house that feels like it was built in 2024 with these super high spaces. We're looking for a degree of intimacy. And so it really settled on, okay, we're comfortable with this, and this is getting us what we want. And it was also scheduled. It was going to take longer to build a new house. Probably would have taken.
But still, okay, I love the answer, but what would the delta have been to make those choices?
So I'm going to answer it generically, not because I'm trying to avoid the question, but because I think it's probably a better answer. If for a comprehensive renovation like that, right? And Scott, jump in here. The utilities and the mechanicals are not changing. It's all new HVAC, it's all new electrical, it's all new plumbing, fixtures, labor, etc. The windows are all new. The roof is all new. All the interior finishes, the paint, the trim, the millwork, the tile, the stone.
It begs the question, what are we saving?
Yeah.
Correct. So in that case, it was foundation. Now, here's a site-specific thing. That's a site that has a lot of ledge on it. We knew what we were up against on the renovation. If we start moving that house around and we're blasting, you have the cost of that. You have considerations with proximity to the neighbors and what, potential risks there. So those types of uncertainties really playing a factor there.
You didn't answer the question.
Oh, sorry. All right. So what's the delta? The delta is what they saved on site work and what they saved on foundation work and some framing. Realistically, they probably spent the same amount on framing. So I don't know. It probably at the end of the day would have been $1 million. If I threw a dart at it.
The difference.
Not to be cavalier about $1 million.
But let's just say, even from a percentage standpoint, say, a good renovation of a house, say, is 100%. To rebuild the house would be 200%.
Oh, I don't know. No.
Oh, it depends on the condition of the
No.
existing house too.
Yeah.
It's like, I think if you bought a house that was built in 2015 and you're changing around a bunch of the sort of the floor plan and you're keeping some areas the same and, it meets a lot of your needs, but you're adding something on, then renovation is going to save you a lot of money versus starting over. If you're gutting a house, as Ryan had just pointed out, if let's say you're more than 20 years old, the mechanicals are now there's huge changes, and you may not even be able to use the same ones. The insulation is wildly different, the building envelope different, your windows are near the end, the roof, it's at that point where you're like, well, probably ought to replace the roof. And if you take a window, and if you were to shrink a window a little bit, then you can save the wall. But if you take a window and you move it just this far, you're getting rid of almost half a wall. So why save the rest of the wall? And to save that wall, that half a wall, you may spend as much as if you didn't, as if you did a new wall anyway. So it's how much are you really saving versus how much are you pretending to save? And the reality is you're gutting it all and just doing it differently.
And not to mention the uncertainty and the risk. On a renovation, and particularly the older house gets, every time you open that wall, there's a new discovery there. So you have to have a higher contingency when you start. We go through this all the time. It's like, and if you're prepared to do it, that's fine. It becomes problematic though when you're trying to jam everything into the renovation because you think you're going to save some money, and then all of a sudden you're confronted with something you didn't expect,
And renovations, when there's a footprint expansion, have the least economy of scale, right? Because you have all those trades coming in. You're doing a new foundation, you're doing new windows, you're doing new siding, etc. But on a cost per square foot basis, maybe you're only adding 500, 1,000 feet. I don't know what it is. So that's the least efficient path.
Yeah.
We're used to that in New York because here you don't rebuild an apartment, right? I mean, you got renovated,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
you are renovating it because
Yeah.
it is what it is. But when you open
Yeah.
those pre-war walls, it's like, wow, the guy from next door, his gas line is crossing this
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
So you can't move that.
There's also a huge while you're at it factor. We find that when people are renovating, they open up their ceiling to do one thing and they say, oh, well, we've got it open. We might as well replace all the lights. You know, we can do flangeless recessed fixtures now or whatever. And the costs tend to snowball more on a renovation.
Hindsight is 20/20. What you don't know in the beginning, you learn at the end. And, I think I suspect when we're talking about gut renovations, a fair number of people look back and say, you know what, I probably could have built a new house for what I just spent here, but they didn't know that at the start, and nobody could have predicted how things would have unfolded. It's the way it happened.
And in other cases, as people become emotionally attached to something. Sometimes there's beautiful exterior architecture, and it is really the inside that needs to be redone. While top architects and contractors know how to create age and patina, it's hard. And if you can save something that actually has that age and patina, that's great. If it's worth saving, if all the mortar's coming out and you got to repoint everything and change and cut, various stones, maybe you aren't saving it. At which point, then let's just do it new and make it look old. A lot of decisions.
How good? So I want to understand the decision-making process. If I'm going into this, or one of my clients is going into this, at what point are you going to be able to tell me the economics of rebuilding versus renovating? And how accurate are you going to be? And how likely am I to be surprised at the end where I say, let's just renovate, we can just renovate. And you say, well, I don't know until I open up some of these walls. Well, we really don't know. So talk to me about, when is the client going to know? And you've already pointed out, sometimes it's not just economics. Sometimes they're making decisions for other reasons other than economics. But talk to me about the estimating of a rebuild versus renovate decision.
So we try to bring a builder in really early, and whether that's the builder who ends up building it or not, we don't know yet. But the sooner the better, to throw some darts at it. And this is usually on a cost per square foot basis because they don't have all the interior elevations. They don't know how much millwork we're going to draw. They don't have all the details, but they can do it based on pretty schematic plans. They can say, I think it's going to be, $1,000 a square foot, for example. And they're usually within 20% of what it ends up being. They can usually
say that again. You
I said the number they give us is usually within 20% of what it actually is. They're not going to be dead on. They don't have enough detail to be dead on. But getting that early on informs the client, okay, maybe we've done two schemes, new house, renovation. We can get that preliminary pricing early on, and they can make a decision, a somewhat informed decision, at the beginning.
So they're within 20% of what would be the range 90% of the time.
Hopefully, I mean,
because it always goes
if
over.
it's a builder we've worked with, they tend to know.
20, it's always the 20% over. It's never under.
No, well, but especially on renovation, though.
I'm just saying. It just
yes, but if you're prepared,
it's always more. It's always more.
No, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's what the contingency is for. You're absolutely right.
And most of the time, that's the owner's fault.
Yeah, I was just
The
saying,
owner doesn't even know what they want at that point.
that's totally true. So often we could do an assessment day one, like should we renovate or should we build new? But it's not until day 700 that you know what the renovation actually entailed, because there were so many changes along the way, the wall you were at, etc. So it's a really hard assessment to make.
Day
It's
700.
obviously when the house that you're working with is a piece of garbage.
I'm having the same reaction, Roberto. Day 700. And Scott, is 20% plus or minus 20% good enough in your world? Really?
It's all, well, I using an artillery analogy, I mean, this is fire and adjust. So we come in, we talk about a little bit of stuff, and there may not even really be a dream list right now. And so you say, well, for kind of what you're describing now, it's $1 million. And then if the client goes, oh, wonderful, that's great. Then you keep designing and they get to add some stuff and get into what they want. If the client said, ooh, I want $500,000, then at that point, Ryan and Mary, it's like, okay, well, let's really change the scope. Let's not go anywhere further on this. We got to really change the scope. We got to really modify the design. And there's a lot of work because you're not going to get $1 million worth of work for 500. You're not going to get anything close. It's a whole different project. So that's why, this happens multiple times along the way, and it involves some thought time. It involves a lot of discussions, and you want to check back in. I mean, every once in a while you have a client that,
I'm going to ask it a different way. When you estimate $1 million of new construction, are you highly certain that you're going to be able to do it for the $1 million you told them?
I think it's important when
yeah,
that
because we were
happens.
saying in schematic, when Scott doesn't have the information he needs to give it an accurate estimate. So he's really throwing darts at that point. That's not to
So new construction, highly confident, renovation, not so confident.
More higher level of confidence in new construction, but it's an amount of information. I mean, have you detailed the interiors of the house? Did you say you want a wood roof and it turns out you want 3/4-inch wood shakes, Alaskan yellow shakes, as opposed to 5/8 or something? I mean, there's which types of windows. I mean, the window decision can have $1 million delta on a $5 million house. I mean, so there's just a lot of detail to get into. And I think most people, and Ryan and Mary will probably comment on this, but you'll provide a range, and that range is, which way. And then again, if the client's very comfortable, they'll tend to keep going toward the high range and do more of what they want. If they're uncomfortable, then they need to have a lot of discipline, and they can't have everything you want. You have to keep that discipline.
But it's really important to have these conversations. And this is the real challenge as soon as you can, because if you go down the design path of I'm going to renovate this house and you develop full construction documents, that's 80% of our fee is when we're done with full construction documents. And then all of a sudden it becomes apparent that you want a new house instead, or it's better, more optimal to do a new house. Well, those construction documents are worth nothing. So that's why, even if you can get within 20%, it probably puts you in the ballpark to say, okay, I think we should go this direction or that direction, even if we don't know definitively where it's going to land, because we haven't gone through the design process. We haven't refined the drawings enough such that the contractor and subcontractors can really provide refined pricing. It's a tough.
You guys, a question, just because they're not in the room. How do you guys feel about designers?
Oh, interior designers?
We like them. They make our work photographable at the end. They're a critical partner.
But do you ever feel, for example, you're like, look, we're hitting the budget on these people, and Jenny is like really just killing the budget here. She's like,
their budget is different than our budget typically, though. Their scope is usually pretty defined, and it doesn't overlap a lot. Maybe the client has another budget in their head, which is the holistic budget of everything.
Yes, because the client looks at the pie, right? There's a pie.
Yeah.
And then the designer comes along and is like, here's a different piece of the pie. It's like, I don't want to pay for that.
I mean,
that's the thing.
I think our approach generally is like, we want to be collaborators with the designers. It's not meant to be us or them. It's both of us together. And that's not just lip service. I think it
makes for a way better final project.
And ultimately, and this is the way we believe about what we believe about the design process too. The client has to be the decision maker on how they want to allocate their resources. If the client says they want to put 70% of their funds towards draperies and textiles, well, who are we to say you shouldn't do what you want? Now, the flip side of that is we have to present compelling enough designs that the architecture speaks to them, and they recognize that from an investment standpoint, whatever the case might be, it might be beneficial, or they could better achieve their overall goals for the building enterprise by doing X, Y, Z on the architecture side. But at the end of the day, the designers are always going to be a help to the team. We want to work with interior designers, 100%.
And they should be part of the pre-construction process, because the only time that, not the only time, but in general, when a decorator is not well received, it's when they come in when the house is like 90% built, and now we're going to change all of the light fixtures, we're going to move all the electric, we're going to add shades in places that they weren't. That's not welcome.
Yeah.
In the beginning, if you can lay it all out and do this, and then there's a collaboration, and I love seeing great collaborations between architects and designers where you really get to see something, something started out as an idea, it gets batted back and forth by creative people, and you literally watch something become better in front of your eyes. And that's a lot of fun, as long as the house isn't already built.
So I've got a question. I've got a favorite question on this sheet, and it's even for Roberto, because I'd like to know how they're thinking about it in New York. But how have the recent real estate market changes influenced the renovation and rebuilding trends? It occurs to me that people are looking for value, and at a certain point in New York, they say, I'm going to go for new construction to get good value. And at some point, new construction goes high, and they say, I'm going to see if I can go find something that's been overlooked and renovate. But Scott Hobbs tells me that renovation costs are startlingly high over the last couple of years since COVID. So how have some of the trends, economic trends and otherwise, changed the thinking on rebuild versus renovate? Roberto, what is the current thinking in New York? Where can I get value?
Well, you have to have the appetite to do the work, and it takes time, and you have to obviously live somewhere else while you're carrying this property. And a lot of our housing stock is co-ops, so you have to have a lot of excess liquidity just to be approved. And if they know that you're going to be renovating, they're going to want to see even more liquidity still. But that is where you get the best value. When just after COVID, the differential was that things that needed renovation were selling about 70% of value. Now it's shrunk a little bit because some people are diving into it more and more because the supply chains and things have improved. It's probably 25% of value. 75% of value. But still, the one thing also is that when you talk about like new construction and everything, you can go to some really, really nice buildings. After 5 years, 6 years, everything in those buildings starts to look old, unless you're in a super nice building, like maybe a Robert A.M. Stern building or something like that. But a lot of stuff starts to read really old. And there are people who, for example, they'll even say a pre-war apartment, they renovate it, spend a tremendous amount of money. 5-6 years, they're trying to get out. They want all their money back. It's like, this isn't new anymore. Like, what are you talking about? So that proposition is a difficult one, and it's a big decision.
That's fascinating. What I heard you say was it's moved from 30% discount to 25% discount. Do you expect that continue to move, or have we seen as much movement?
I think it just depends upon cost, and it depends upon inventory. So right now, there hasn't been much construction because of COVID and because of so many different policy changes and things like that. So a lot of new construction is going to be lean as far as providing inventory to the marketplace. So people are going to have to be looking at these other places as options. So it should increase the value of them because there should be a little bit more demand.
Ryan?
I say there's also an issue that gets into timeless design versus the fad of the moment. And I'm sure that Ryan and Mary are much better at this because they've studied this forever, but we've all had that situation where you literally two houses look almost the same next to each other, and you say, I like that one better. And you can't identify why, but the reality is because you had people like Ryan and Mary there that actually paid attention to this stuff and understand why the human brain and eye likes this, as opposed to somebody who tore out a picture from the magazine and said, make something like this. And those are two very different things.
Also, just chime in, one of the things that I think no question has impacted this, exactly what's at stake in this discussion, do you renovate or rebuild new, is inventory. There's just nothing for sale for people to buy. So people are looking around saying, well, we have clients where we did complete schematic design, several schemes on a gut renovation and significant addition to their house in Greenwich. And they said, this makes no sense. We're gonna move somewhere else. They've been trying and trying and trying. We just were talking about this morning. It's been going on for probably 9 months. They can't find anything. So what do? They're gonna just stick in their existing house and live in a way that they don't want to do, or they're gonna pull the trigger now, and the problem is nobody knows what's coming down the pike, right? So they're going to pull the trigger now, start construction, and 3 months down the road, that dream house or something much closer might come out there, and it's a really tough call. I'm sure you guys confront this all the time.
So what I hear you saying is that somebody living in an ugly house says, I'm going to go find a pretty house. And when they can't, they do come to you and say, can you make my ugly house pretty?
Totally.
Yeah.
I think there's a huge amount of that over the past few years, as there's been such a tightening of the inventory. People realizing we've got to do something. So, like, it's.
Are you a miracle worker? Can you make my ugly house pretty?
We'll just tell you to tear it down.
With a big budget, anything is possible.
You can almost use a tailoring analogy. It's like, if you buy a suit and you have that suit for a while, you got to go back to the tailor every once in a while and have some stuff done to it. Because you've changed, the styles have changed, there's stuff's different. And sometimes you can end up going ahead and having the suit tailored and updated. Other times you can't. And if you can't, you can't. I don't care how much maybe if it's your mother's wedding dress, maybe you'll go to the extreme to make it work. But for most things, you're not that emotionally attached. And for a house, you have a lot of similarities.
How often do you find yourself getting to the property, shaking your head, and you just know the answer right away, but it's going to take me a little bit more time to get to what you already know, Scott, Ryan, Mary. You already know when you get there, the layout doesn't work. It's the wrong spot on the property. And we can make a huge difference if this client can get to that decision where he doesn't feel it's wasteful, right? For all of those of us who were told, eat all your peas, do not be wasteful. We've been told our entire lives to recycle and don't be wasteful. It's very hard for some of us, money aside, economics aside. And you may know the right answer in the first 5 minutes, but it might take your clients maybe a little bit longer to accept throwing something away and starting over. Do you know it in the first 2 minutes? Oh, wrong proportions, wrong location.
Depends.
This has got to go.
There are some waterfront examples where there's that improvement limit, and then you know it before you even get out of the car. But no, it depends.
It depends what the client wants too. Like when we show up to visit a property, we might have different ambitions for that than what the client wants, and ultimately their ambitions and aspirations have to drive that process and that decision making. So it's never an instant, but I think very quickly, when just in a conversation, probably after that conversation, that's when we know, not in the beginning. I would say. That first meeting, like, it's not so easy as just, I'm going to build a second floor here.
I've got a confession here, and it's a good example of this, but I bought a 200-year-old house, and we got to the point where the conversation turns to the floors. And I say, I want to save the floors. And the builder shakes his head and he says, these floors have been sanded down quite a few times. There's not a lot left. Don't know if we can save your floors. Why do you want to save your floors? We can stain your new floors for less money than it's going to take to renovate your floors.
Yeah, but
I
you're
can put in new floors and they can be the same color. And yet, and I just bought this house. I shouldn't feel sentimental about these.
I get it.
It's not logical, but I do. And so today I have dark fir floors. They were able to, sand them down one more time, and it makes me feel good.
Totally.
And I don't know why, but it makes me.
That's why you bought the house, John.
Exactly.
You came in and you're like, I love these floors. So.
And you feel like the caretaker of that house in some ways, which I can understand. It's almost like there's an inverse relationship between whether to tear the house down or not and the age of the house. You might think that an older house, an old structure, we're more likely to tear down. But in fact, an older house, the older it is, the more likely you are to say, oh, we've come this far, we got to save the house, we've got to restore the house. Ryan and I live in an 1899 house that we bought, that the same family had lived in for 62 years. I mean, amazing story. And we wanted to restore it. We wanted to do the right thing for that house. We ended up gutting a large part of the interiors, but also replicating what we could find that was original, like the balusters on the stair, and doing our best to kind of be true to the house. So John, I totally understand what you're saying. Hang on to those fir floors for as long as you can.
So in this endeavor, whether you guys are the first meeting, right? You guys come see the house. You don't talk to a contractor first to just kind of loosely get an idea. You come to the house, and then you would like get an understanding of what the property is. Then you would go, like if someone wanted to expand, then you go figure out, you go to the zoning and say, well, you do have X number of, you can go this way, down, up, sideways. But you're the first meeting.
Often,
right?
I mean, sometimes the clients may have brought a contractor in, and you know that can sometimes also be in the back of their head where the contractor says, why would you save this? The contractor may not be thinking about things the same way around. That's not right or wrong. I'm just saying the contractor saying, why would you save this? You can do a new thing here for, you know, half the cost. And that they could do a new thing. The question is whether they want to do a new thing for what they want to get out of the project. So that's ultimately what we're trying to get to in that exploration process. And we don't have a hat in the race, so to speak.
Many of my brethren are very much black and white people. Under it's yes, no. And the reality is at this end, you want a builder again that we do exactly what Ryan and Mary do, where it's like, we got to talk. I got to keep my prejudices out of this, and we got to talk and describe, and based on your answers, that'll lead me one way or another. I mean, I'll be honest about what my assessment is, but if you love this and you're willing to pay for what that love is, then we ought to, you know, let's approach this. Let's go for it. If you're making compromise after compromise, you're like, why in the world would you put yourself through this for that? That's a silly way to go.
There are certain things that you can't get in a new house that you can get in an old house.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the third tread from the top of the staircase on our staircase creaks, and every morning I walk down and I jump over that so I don't wake up whoever is still sleeping upstairs. And that sounds crazy, but I love it. That makes me feel like this is my house. That quirkiness, the idiosyncratic nature of that tread, right? And yeah, you can have idiosyncrasies in new houses, but often the kind of goal is this is new. Everything should be perfect. And so it's just the personality. It's a preference a lot of times. It's not even about the fundamentals of, you know, the site or other things.
It's also craftsmanship. Older houses tend to have more craft that were done by artisans that don't really exist anymore. I mean, we can do anything. Sure, if you want a sculpted stone entryway, probably we would use a robot to build it now rather than you know, a guy with a chisel. But old houses tend to have more ornament and detail, and that original character that can't always be replicated.
Can I pull? We have 2 minutes to do one more case study. This is called Greenwich Renovation. I can't tell that this is a renovation because it looks sparkling and new.
I wish we had before photos of this. This was an unfinished attic before, and this came out of COVID. They wanted a his and hers work from home space. So this is his office and her office and a lounge in between. We joke these clients are like our Medicis because now we're doing our 4th project for them. They're just the gift that keeps on giving. And it's been in many phases. It's a relatively new-ish house, probably within the last 25 years. But it's quite traditional on the outside, and they've slowly been starting at the 3rd floor, going down, making it more modern on the interior.
Very cool.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Very cool.
And that's a case where they really like the house, but just wanted to update and refresh things. So the changes, you know, it's not like there were wholesale changes to the attic accepted, which was a whole new space, but
yeah.
It just wasn't what they wanted for for this moment.
And we did explore footprint expansions at one point, but again, like what we said earlier, it just doesn't make sense on a cost per square foot basis often to do a small footprint expansion. So we ended up keeping it largely within the existing volume. We're doing a pool house now, but other than that, it's been within the existing volume.
Roberto, Scott, what did we learn?
A lot.
Well,
It's complicated, and it's not an easy decision. It's a very complicated decision. It's very personal, and it can, I think at the very high luxury level, it's about personal preference, but I think the overwhelming majority of people, it is a financial decision.
I think it's an inventory decision. If I've got, doesn't matter how much money I have, sometimes maybe there's nothing out there to buy.
Sure.
Scott?
I think a lot of it's process. Each situation is unique. There is not one answer. It's process, and you want to have good guides to help you go through that process and figure out what's right for you.
Mary, do you want the last word?
No, don't put that pressure on me.
Brian?
No, I'm good. I've been talking too much.
No, I think
Thank
this
you,
is
John.
great. What I learned, and maybe the last word from you guys, is that you keep an open mind. You'll design me a new house, or you can fix my ugly house. And each client's different, and their motivations and the site and the regulations will dictate. So thank you. This has been
You guys are awesome.
Thank you all so much.
This has been great. If you
Love
like this, tell all your friends, and like it, subscribe, and see, and come back next week, Thursdays, 3 o'clock, Boroughs and Burbs. I think next week we're doing Dubai. Are we doing Dubai next week?
I don't know if that's scheduled, but I because of the time difference, I think that we're going to record that.
Okay.
I'm just not sure when.
So
but that'll be interesting.
From Renovate to Dubai, Boroughs and Burbs, we've got it all. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you guys so much. Take care.
Thank you.